want to check my sound. Good to go? Hello, welcome. My name is Chris Chase. I'm the project director for the Western Flyer Foundation. I'm in charge of kind of overseeing the restoration of the Western Flyer, which has been going on in Port Townsend, Washington for the last 6, 7, 8 years. The boat's been up there for about 9, getting worked on for about 7 or 8. I put this up here to start. This is an excerpt from the log from the Sea of Cortez, as you can see in the bottom. The project for me, and pretty much my 35 years as a professional wood shipwright, really comes down to the last sentence, building the unconscious memories of our ancestors. You know, you can look through the hallway here, and there's old antique tools, there's old antique bandsaws in these shops. I really have a connection, and I think many of us are drawn to wooden boats because of that unconscious connection to our ancestors. And I just thought this was, you know, I read the book soon after getting involved with the Western Flyer project, and this just stands out for me. It really said, wow, this is a project to get involved with. So I thought it was a fun place to start. Like I said, a little English lesson. If you have not picked up a copy of the log from the Sea of Cortez, I highly recommend. It is a book about a trip to the Sea of Cortez. The Western Flyer, the vessel, plays a very large role in that story, but it's really a philosophy book about humans and our connection to the world around us, so highly recommend it. But the boat that John Steinbeck is talking about is this boat right here, the Western Flyer, 77 feet long, 20 feet wide, built in Tacoma, Washington in 1937, specifically for the sardine fishery in Monterey, California. At that point in time, that fishery was just surging. It was, you know, the fishery to be at on the west coast of the United States. So there were many vessels all up and down the west coast that were built specifically for that. There were 4 sister ships to the Western Flyer built in Tacoma at the Western Boat Building Company that year. Obviously boats in Ballard, boats in Gig Harbor. There were a lot of boats headed that way. But this is that, you know, man builds the best of himself into a boat. This is the boat that John Steinbeck is talking about. This is Commencement Bay on sea trials. But this, somewhere, it doesn't advance. Go back this way. I'm advanceless. What? Chooses. Sorry about that. That's the boat that I was introduced to. So when I got introduced to the Western Flyer, this is the summer of 2013. Western Flyer did have a relationship with John Steinbeck. It was only 6.5 weeks long. It went on to fish all up and down the west coast. Obviously Monterey, California, Seattle, Bellingham, all the way out to the end of the Aleutians. It finally ended up in Anacortes, Washington, where tied to the dock, a little bit of neglect, a lot of rainwater, probably a bilge pump that someone tripped over the extension cord, and the thing literally sunk tied to the dock. Actually twice back to back. It sank for a week, it was raised, and it sank again a few weeks later for about 6 months. It was brought to Port Townsend because we had the big travel lift. There was no other reason. It was just a serendipitous thing that happened. The Western Flyer is towed to Port Townsend, Washington, hauled out of the water, put on the hard out behind the shops there. And it just turned out that Port Townsend is kind of that epicenter of wood boat construction. There are close to 300 men and women that are making their living in the maritime industry. Many of those are very connected to the wood boat industry. So by fate, the Western Flyer ends up in Port Townsend, Washington. A great place for it to end up. I could talk about pretty much anything involved with this boat project. We could talk about Steinbeck all night long. We could talk about Ed Ricketts. We could talk about all the strange characters that fished on this boat. Jackie Ray, who died up in the Aleutian Islands aboard the boat. Stig Hansen, his dad's very first fishing vessel ever in North America was the Western Flyer in 1964. But I thought, since this is the Center for Wooden Boats, we better talk about wooden boat construction. So if you're interested in all the rest of it, catch me later. I'll tell you some stories. But this is how the Western Flyer sat for about 1.5 to 2 years. And in 2015, a gentleman from California had been touched by that book. That book, The Sea of Cortez, had really influenced his life and the way he looked at the world and man's and humans' connection to the greater environment around us. He had the means to buy the vessel, and he purchased the vessel, and he started in motion this restoration. At this point in the project, I was the lead shipwright on the project. I built this carriage and this road. I was involved with pulling the boat into the building. I was going to be that guy that ran the crew, swung the hammer, corked the boat, hung the planks. But pretty quickly into the project, I was really falling in love with the idea of the project. The people that came to visit the project, the people that stopped by to see the boat, the stories I was hearing, and I hung up my Carhartts and put away my chisels and my hand planes, and I stepped to the other side of the desk and I became the project director, kind of the eyes and ears for the nonprofit that was growing around the Western Flyer restoration. So I took that role in that position. So I did not do the work on the project. I did actually put a couple of boards in the boat early on in the project, but the Port Townsend Shipwrights Co-op did the lion's share of the hard restoration work. The hull, deck, and house is how we refer to it in the wood boat world. You know, your project is in thirds, right? The hull, deck, and house is a third of the cost of your project. The mechanical is a third of the cost, and the outfitting of the boat is a third of the cost. So they did the heavy lifting. They did the stem, the stern, which we're going to see here in a second, planking, frames, all that good stuff. Very first thing we did was we rolled it into that building at the Port Townsend Shipwrights Co-op, got it staged in the middle of the building. We tried to advance a slide. And we started to stabilize the boat. You know, old boat, once you take them out of the water, you know, an old shipwright years ago told me, you know, the water holds the planks on when it's in the water and the fasteners hold the planks on when it's out of the water. Well, this boat was tired, 85, 82 years of hard work, couple of sinkings under its belt. The first thing to do was really to stabilize the boat, build these external walls around the boat, make sure nothing else fell off the boat, but also do kind of an archaeological dig, sifting down through 80 years of fishing. What was old, what was new, what was rotted, what had to be replaced. As that started to happen, the foundation was starting to grow, getting a little traction, starting to make some money, starting to get a little cash in the bank to pay for the restoration. And in about 2017, the Shipwrights Co-op really started to step it up into high gear. It sat in the building for a couple of years in that early stages. And then 2017, they really started to put the heat on it. First thing you need to do is kind of prop it up again. You know, it's that beam shelf, it's that clamp, it's those 4.5 longitudinal timbers that hold the shape of the boat. But you also need to connect them with deck beams. So there is a systematic way to go through a restoration like this. And we could talk about different approaches, but if you just started willy-nilly taking boards off the boat, you'd come back in the morning and you'd have a pile of boards on the floor. So those outside stabilizing walls trying to hold the shape. The starboard side was in quite a bit worse shape than the port side, so the shipwrights pulled a half breadth off of the port side and lofted out the full breadth of the boat to be able to push the boat out and pull the boat and jack the shear up. They actually lifted the stern up about 6 inches. Over time, you know, what happened? It's a hell of a slideshow. Anyway, over time, a boat hogs, but that also forces the stern and the stem to fall off. Oh, we kind of skipped ahead there, didn't we? It's a heck of a slideshow, I promise. So I got no slides, no action.
There might be some missing slides in the middle there.
Well, they're kind of the. No, we're kind of going. We're like way different part of my slideshow. Cool part of the slideshow. You're going to love it when we get there. Looks like we're reloading. So anyway, stabilizing the boat's a really critical part of a restoration like this. You know, many of you in the room probably have tackled a project like this before. Maybe it was a house. Go back a couple more. Wait right there. That's where I was.
I think there must be a slide in the slideshow that isn't there. Pull up the slides. It's not like...
All right. Hoping I throw myself off here. All right. Let's just stop here for a split second. So many of you have tackled projects like this before. Maybe it was a car restoration or house restoration or boat restoration. You know, getting a plan is really critical. Figuring out what's old and new. You know, when you restore something, you're going to a moment in time. We chose the spring of 1940. John Steinbeck and his buddy Ed Ricketts left Monterey, California in the spring of 1940 on their famed trip. So we drew that line in the sand and said 1940 is going to be our day. So that was what we were restoring to. After a lot of the hull had been stabilized, some of the fore and aft structural timbers had been replaced, we had a shape that could be worked with. The next big phase was to remove this wheelhouse off the boat. You know, being able to get to the innards of the boat without having to dig down through the deck beams. A lot of the foredeck beams needed to be replaced. So pulling the house.
Point it towards me, that'll also.
No, that's actually a slide. That's actually a video. Do you want to just advance them? How about I just tell you to advance them? I think we're pretty much past the surprises here. Anyway, getting the house off the boat was the next big chapter. You know, we wanted to be able to get down into the boat, replace some of the innards, some of the structural timbers, and have easy access to that. So the shipwrights at the Port Townsend Shipwrights came up with a contraption that kind of grabbed a hold of the entire house in one big chunk, and they lifted it up off of the boat using the overhead bridge crane and lowered it down to a facsimile of the foredeck down behind the boat. And with that off the boat and access, they could get a little deeper into the boat. Now they attacked a lot of those deck beams. They did the forward beam shelf and clamp. I might just be talking for the next 20 minutes. It's too bad you can't see that really cool video.
Yeah, I think it's having trouble bringing up videos.
Okay, well there's 3 really cool videos. One has Pete Stein in it. You're all going to miss that one. So anyway, with the house off the boat, looking down on the boat, able to get a little deeper down into the boat. They replaced this horseshoe stern. This is stacked like bricks in a brick wall. Boat was built in 1937, primarily out of Douglas fir. I jokingly say wood like that doesn't grow on trees anymore. We go further and further into the forest looking for species to replace that. This is actually Purple Heart, which is a hardwood that comes from Central South America, and actually a lot of ours comes from northern South America. I think French Guiana is where most of the Purple Heart comes from. They replaced this the horseshoe stern. It's all bronze, drifted and bolted together. They're able to do a lot of the foredeck beams. See if this slide goes. Able to get down deep into the boat. A lot of the structural work. This is the start of the forekeel. Obviously Purple Heart again. I just put this in because folks, you're all wood boat folks, but folks that aren't familiar with Purple Heart are always fascinated by the color of Purple Heart. It is such a vibrant wood. It's interesting, when it's air dried, it's much browner, and it actually oxidizes. When you first power plane it, this is freshly planed, it turns that vibrant purple, and if it's been air dried, it actually oxidates back to a brown color. It's quite boring looking. The kiln dried wood is the stuff people make ballpoint pens, and it's all vibrantly purple. Boy, we're like all over the place. Hopefully this video plays. All right, don't play yet. So after a lot of that structural work had been done, the next big task of the boat project was to replace the ribs, the steam bent frames, the rib cage of the boat, those fore and aft frames. In the case of the Western Flyer, they are 3 inches by 4 inches, 18-foot long steam bent oak. You go ahead and play this if you'll play. Come on. Look at that, something to watch. To find the wood, I went pretty far. I actually am in Berea, Kentucky, on the campus of Berea College, where we harvested about 16 white oak trees, 19 feet long. The one caveat with Berea College is everything has to be horse logged off their college campus, and everything is harvested for sustainable harvest only. So we cruised the forest, we found 16 adequate trees, and we harvested those trees. And they came back to Port Townsend, Washington, and played this slide. And they were put into a steam box as green as possible. And if you watch Leo's videos, you'll see that's Pete Stein. They're 3 inches by 4 inches. You steam them for 1 inch an hour. So a 3-inch timber, 3 inches of steaming at about 205 to 200 degrees. And the shipwrights have about, 10, maybe 15 minutes of working time before it starts to actually harden up. So it becomes a piece of spaghetti. You're heating the lignin of the wood, the glue, and you're letting those fibers stretch across each other to actually bend around that shape of the boat. And once it's hammered down into the beam, into the frame pocket, the heel pocket, they can actually worry it up and around the boat and pull it into place. See if this, oh, we'll just stop there. Sorry about the slides. So the steam bending, again, they have about 15 minutes to work with this hot timber to put it in the boat. They had 64 pairs, one for each side, of steam bent frames to put into the boat. They steamed all 6 men, there was 1 gal occasionally, 6 guys, steamed all 64 pairs in the boat in 30 days. It was definitely a well-oiled machine. They understood what they were doing. They were all very seasoned professional shipwrights, and it went in like, clockwork. I think they actually ended up breaking and pulling out 2 frames of the 128 frames they put in the boat, which is pretty amazing. It needs to be as green as humanly possible. So I harvested that wood in March of that year. By the time it was actually on and in a truck, it was in Port Townsend by May, and they were steaming them in the boat by June. So another great shot here, putting the stem in the boat. There are about 19 original timbers in the boat. People ask about that. Talk about that in a minute. Just great shots. You see that nice Purple Heart stern leading into a series of 18 sawn frames and then going into those 64 pairs of steam bent frames. Preparing really at this point for the hull planking. Got all those frames. Photos taken looking up in the stern, and it's just like a whale carcass. It's really nice shots. So the next phase of the project is the planking. Again, built out of Douglas fir originally. Lots of planks on this boat were nearly full length. There were lots of 50s and 60-foot planks on the boat. It is really these days, and we could talk about Douglas fir for a while. So the shipwrights in the Pacific Northwest go pretty far wood. In the case of the Flyer, I found SIPO, which is grown in. This wood I purchased was an FSC, Stewart County. It is 2 3/8 inches thick. That man is 5 feet 8 inches tall. That's a 60-inch wide board, 39 feet 6 inches long. I had to cut 6 inches off the end of the timber to get it in a 40-foot container. But just like the steam bent frames that go around the boat, you steam the planking onto the boat, and probably many of you are familiar with this. The dressed thickness, it started at 2 3/8. We got air-dried material. We lost about 1/8 of an inch in air drying, maybe a little less, and we surfaced it down to 2 inches, a full 2 inches. So just like the steam bent frames, they were able to steam and worry each one of those planks into place. They get fastened on with a bronze number 20 by 4 inch bronze screw, originally built with iron fasteners, iron nails, iron backbone bolts. Now, this was a fishing vessel. They built 4 of these in one winter. Definitely a big upgrade to go with bronze. When Martin Petridge built this boat in 1937, I'm sure he thought it would last 5, 6, 7, 10 years, and we'll just build another one, right? I think the original price was like $6,500 or something. So really, they didn't see this as something you kept restoring. So we took that thinking, well, we want it to last another 50 plus years. The bronze iron is definitely substantial, but a project, it was definitely going with the bronze fasteners. Just great shapes. Many of you are familiar with this maybe. Some of the smaller vessels have these just beautiful shaped planks. A board might look straight, but it's actually quite a banana in shape. By the time you bend it up around, more flare, more banana, a lot of these tucks. This is the second broad, they're calling it. First plank down is called the garboard, and then you have a series of broad planks. These broads actually are steelers. They double down, but anyway, just nice wide boards. Some of that lower boards probably came out of 17-inch wide, 18-inch wide boards. Great shapes. Just like with the steam bent frames, it was a well-oiled machine. You did see that one gal, Jenny. She hung a lot of planks on this boat. It was great to have her on the team. Unfortunately, she's not with them anymore, but it was about 6 people, occasionally 7 people working on the boat, and they were able to hang 6,000 linear feet. We all think about planking in linear. So 6,000 linear feet of planking in just under 4 months. They had it dialed in to where a team of 6 shipwrights were hanging about 60 to 80 linear feet a day, every day of the week. And those were 9-hour days. So I've been in the boat industry a long time, 35 years, hung a lot of planks in my life. But to see people, repeatedly hanging 35-foot planks every 5 hours is pretty phenomenal. So they definitely had it dialed in. And this is right before COVID. We didn't really talk about the timeline here, but they were able to get all of the hull planking. They actually hung the whiskey plank like a few days before COVID shut down the boatyard. So they never lost that momentum of the project, which probably was the saving grace for the project. You lose momentum, sometimes it's hard to get it back. Just great shapes. Wood boats, as John Steinbeck said, or man builds the best of himself into these boats. They are really, truly beautiful shapes. Just that long line of infinity that just never ends. You can't really see where it starts or where it stops. I think that's what we're attracted to about the shapes of a boat, that long, sweeping line. So after the hull planking, things did ramp back up after COVID. Hull planking gets prime painted. That is a red lead on the bottom. Just great shots. You remember that house? We didn't get to see get pulled off into the video, but house got pulled off. The house was being restored simultaneously next to the boat. This is all in Port Townsend. Working on the deck, the one place we opted for a modern blend it was a traditional laid corked deck, so it was a 2 3/4 inch thick, 4-inch wide Douglas fir deck, corked and laid. We opted for 2 layers of 3/4 inch marine plywood glued and screwed together with ultimately a 1 1/4 inch Douglas fir overlay, which I think you'll see in a minute, glued in G-Flex epoxy with no fasteners. So that was the one place we opted away from traditional boat building techniques, plank on frame techniques, and incorporated that plywood into the construction. The down below in this boat is going to have a lot of scientific equipment, and we just couldn't afford to have that leakage issue. So we can all debate whether or not cork laid over plywood. There are some places plywood does a pretty amazing thing. Once the hull was basically put together and stabilized, planking done, paint work done, obviously name written on the boat came out of the building for a very short 4 or 5 hours, and that house was simultaneously pulled out and it was craned on the boat. You can see that same contraption. They pulled the house off, kind of grabbed it, just gently grabbed it and put it back on there. It was amazing. This was painted to a gloss finish, and it didn't even crack the seams of the paint. It was just a really stable pick, really nice. They rolled it back into the building the next day, or actually that day, and they continued on building some after hatches, handrails, pipe rails around the deck here, finished off the fly bridge, started working on the decking, started getting some paint on the boat, on the stern here, getting the name finished up, rudder work. Kind of leery of my slideshow here. And just looking good. So we were eager to get on with the mechanical side of the project. So about this time last year, we were eagerly trying to get out of the building, the shipwrights. We wanted to move the boat to Seattle. We opted for a hybrid drive system in this boat, so we can talk about that a little bit, but a conventional diesel engine talking to a hybrid drive, talking to a gearbox, talking to a propeller. And we wanted that work to get done in Seattle here at Snow & Company over in Ballard. So we were eagerly trying to get the boat out of there, so this is those finishing stages of the project. Shipwrights at Co-op, again, were responsible for the hull, deck, and house restoration. They stabilized the boat. They brought the boat back to life. They did just, an amazing amount of hard lifting, but we needed to get to Seattle. So last June, I think this is June 28th, 29th, something like that, the boat came out of the building, bottom painted, bow thruster looking good, rudder in position, all the below water penetrations in place. And we launched the boat that day. We didn't really want a lot of fanfare. It was kind of interesting. You could announce this and have 1,000 people show up, or you could just kind of maybe let the grapevine hear about it. And sure enough, 400 or 500 people showed up, and which was kind of nice. It was nice to see the energy of the community of Port Townsend. This has been a big part of Port Townsend for 7 or 8 years now, and the community has really wrapped their arms around the project. So it was nice to see through word of mouth. You know, people just in the morning, did you hear the Western Flyer came out of the building? Did you hear the Western Flyer is going to launch today? And sure enough, by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you couldn't get a parking spot in the boat haven, and there were 400 people standing at the dock listening to me jabber about launching a boat. So rolled it down to the water and put it in the water. So looking stunning just in the water, getting ready to get towed. Beautiful day, beautiful everything. Just looked like it was dipped in paint. It just was spectacular. Sitting really high out of the water. You are looking at just a giant piece of driftwood. There is nothing. I had them load 14,000 pounds of lead into the fish hold to kind of get a little shoulders on it. But you can see, what are we looking at? You're almost 2 feet of bottom paint, and there really should be about 6 inches. So we got it ready. Everybody kind of walked around and said, well, it doesn't feel like it's going to turtle. Let's tow it to Seattle. Just a great shot of looking at that laid deck. I kind of glazed over that. Again, 2 layers of 3/4 inch plywood, glued and screwed to the deck beams, glassed with 10-ounce fiberglass in epoxy. And then they came back and they glued with hutches. If you're familiar, you got 2 boards, hutch between, to clamp. They put hutches between the seams and glued it in G-Flex epoxy. Once that was cured, they pulled all those hutches and all those fasteners that were penetrating the plywood and ejected epoxy down into every hole along the way. So there are 0 penetrations in the deck, and then came back with maritime rubber and paved all the seams with maritime rubber. So just a great looking. I mean, just everything about the boat was looking beautiful. But we needed to get to Seattle. So the next day, on June 30th, I hired the same tugboat that pulled the boat to Port Townsend in 2013 to tow us to Seattle through the Ballard locks. There is a fantastic guy, I think it's Seattle Channel Spotter on Instagram, and he flies a drone at the canal. So I'm on this boat, I'm on the bow there, and all of a sudden I look up and there's a drone, and I realize and he photographs every boat that's of worth coming through the canal. It's a great Instagram channel, and he sent me these photographs of it. So just cool to see it going through, entering into Seattle here. It's probably been through that gate under that bridge 100 times. It used to fish out of the terminal in the 50s, so definitely a lot of. And we brought it to Snow and Company, which is the old Kviak boatyard along the Ballard ship canal there, between Fremont and Ballard, on the north side of the canal. If you're at the south side, so SPU, Seattle, is it SPU or PLU? SPU. You can actually look across and see the Western Flyer kind of poking its nose out of that tent. And again, the reason for bringing it was the mechanical side of the project, and that's the chapter we're in right now, is installing fuel tanks, installing electrical system. This hybrid system that's come from Italy is called a transfluid. We're essentially built a Prius on the water. Anything under 3 miles an hour, I should say knots, anything under 3 knots is 100% zero emission. It's an electric drive system. Anything over 3 knots, we, in the same drive line, automatically convert back to a conventional diesel engine. So going down the coast, this boat tootles along nicely at like 11 knots. It's a John Deere 6135 series diesel engine driving a twin disc gearbox. And then when we want to be on station for research, we want to be in a pod of whales, near shore coastal work, you can immediately switch to that hybrid drive system. And now we get about 6 to 8 hours at zero emission at that 1 to 3 knots, 2 to 3 knots speed. So really, hybrid is coming to the maritime industry. Right now, it's a battery storage issue. We are pushing, when that launch photo, if we went back a couple slides, the boat was about 130,000 pounds when it launched in Port Townsend. We've added about 130,000 more pounds to the boat. So it's about a 120-ton vessel. It is a very slippery hull in the way it pushes through the water, but still hybrid is a ways away from being a practical application. So we definitely wanted it for that slow operations. The reason that we drove to the hybrid side, we chose that, was this boat's ultimate goal will be near coastal research. And a lot of that time you're at station keeping. You might charge out to a station. You might run 6, 7, 8 hours to a particular location. And now you're going a half a knot. You're going 1 knot. You're keeping pressure on the rudder. You're keeping the bow thruster. But you're really just kind of holding position. And if you're doing that with a traditional diesel engine, you're governing that back with a trolling valve. You're kind of choking the engine a little bit to try to drive slow. So the electric really dovetailed nicely with our application. I think it actually has great application in a lot of these whale watching vessels. It's not as expensive as people think it is. There are a lot of different systems around. I've probably looked at all of them in North America. Danfoss, BAE, obviously Transfluid. You know, we're south of $300,000 to have a system that works for our application. So that's usually a question people like to ask. But let's see if this works. Oh, it did. And it did. And it did. I thought I'd stop here for a second. This might be my last slide. You know, we're around all these wooden boats. All of you are, you know, drawn to them. Clearly, you're here tonight. Clearly, you come down and support the Center for Wooden Boats. Each one of the boats we get on and off of, they have incredible stories. You know, it's a luck that the Western Flyer is around. You know, there were hundreds and hundreds of these carbon copies, essentially. Again, built in Ballard, built in Bellingham, built in Gig Harbor, Scansey built boats, Western Boat Building, Maritime in Tacoma, a lot of companies. And it's interesting to me that of all of the hundreds, and I've worked on many of them, there's really only 4 or 5 left in the world. You know, there's a couple in Port Townsend of this exact same, and they really were carbon copies. This is an H.C. Hansen designed vessel, which was a fairly prominent designer here in the Northwest. But I just wanted people to think about the stories, you know, the men and the women that have been on these boats, the fish they've caught, the stories they've told. And the Western Flyer is a great example of that. You know, here it is in 1937, Commencement Bay. You know, it's sea trials, it's charging across the bay, looking beautiful. A boat that soon Steinbeck would be, you know, brushing up against and taking him on this great journey to the Sea of Cortez. And then here it is in 2013, you know, sunken. You know, we could tell you the boat sank 3.5 times in its life. It keeps getting revived, keeping brought back to life. Here it is getting towed to Port Townsend, Washington to have this beautiful, you know, rebuilding or rebirth of the vessels. So again, boats have just incredible stories. It's a pleasure to work on them. And it does go back to that unconscious memories of our ancestors. You know, why are we drawn to these boats? What are the stories they have to tell and our connection to the world around us? So that was a bit of a kooky slideshow. There was a couple of really cool slides you missed, but dang it, next time. It can be a great part. So I'd be glad to answer questions. I do have a lot of experience with this project, and I have a lot of experience in the boatyard. So be glad to answer some questions. Just leave that up there for a second. Have any questions?
Yeah, I just have a simple one about the
Oh, Christina.
Was that the original paint color?
It was exactly the original paint color. So as you can almost see it in the upper sunk photo there. But my experience is, you know, the very first layer of paint you put on anything in the world, your car, your house, your bike, your boat, only the first layer really hangs on for dear life. The rest of the subsequent layers are just half-ass painted on top of them, and they fall off over time. So when a boat, we brought it into the building of the shipwrights, and things started to dry out, and that outer 6 or 7 or 20 layers of paint fell off, the bottom layer was that color green. That was a proprietary color to the Western Boat Building Company in Tacoma. And the idea behind that proprietary color is you could look out across a fleet of boats, maybe Ballard, maybe the Aleutians, wherever, and you could see that color and go, that's a dang good looking boat. I want a Western Boat Building boat next time. So it is the original color. The Shipwrights Co-op, a couple of the gals that painted the boat, took great pains with that chip of paint in their hand to try to match that chip of paint. So it is the original color to the boat. So. Yeah.
What are your plans for her now?
So the plans for now, so we are at Snow and Company in Ballard. That mechanical is getting finished up over the next, everything takes so much longer than you think, 2 months, 6 weeks, 2 months. We'll make a short trip around the Puget Sound. We're going to do a little flag tour. We hope to actually come down to the center here and just kind of tie up for a day. We want to get back to the Theophos waterway, the Petridge family. If anyone knows Nora Petridge in Port Townsend, it was her family that built the boat. They're a very known family, gigantic Croatian family. We'd like to do a little thank you down there. Obviously stop in Port Townsend. Ultimately get down the coast to Monterey this late spring, where actually the interior is pretty empty. Ultimately, we want a laboratory classroom in the original fish hold. So we got a little California money I need to get down there and spend to do that. So the boat will be in California for at least 4 or 5 months, getting 3 or 4 woodworkers on it, doing interior, fine woodworking, finishing the electrical, finishing. It will leave here looking like a fishing vessel, looking original. And then ultimately back to the Sea of Cortez is again a giant thank you to some of the donors and supporters in the spring of 2014. And then just right into the rotation is near coastal research and education, working out of Monterey, California, mainly Central California coast down into the Sea of Cortez. It's really destined to be a near coastal research and education vessel, taking younger people in very, very small numbers out on the boat. A lot of younger scientists, university level.
Question though, what, through which agency will the boat be in service to?
So in service to, it'll be, the organization that owns it is simple, the Western Flyer Foundation. We're based in Monterey, California, and that is its owner in service to. So the best way, we could skip ahead here, but it'd be just so darn boring. There's a slide that tells you how to find it. Look at that. So you could chase us down that way, westernflyer.org, and a couple other ways. I do have an Instagram, and I used to make YouTube videos, but life got in the way. But anyway, so that's what its job is, to be near coastal research and education boat. There was a question over here, right there.
I was going to ask about her stern reads Tacoma.
Yeah.
But you're going to be.
Well, yeah, it's impossible. So when it was launched, and I almost threw that slide in the slideshow, there's a great photo in 37 slipping down the waves, and it says Western Flyer, Tacoma, Washington. And Port Townsend doesn't own it. Tacoma doesn't own it. Nobody owns it. Monterey doesn't own it, so we put Tacoma back on it. It really was just a tip of the hat to where it was built. You know, that's the easiest answer, is where it was built. So yeah, it wouldn't look right to have.
You said it's going down to California in the spring of this year?
Yeah, so I'm hoping to deliver it with another 2 gentlemen in late April, early May. Kind of do our parade tour here in the Northwest. You know, 4 or 5 stops, 3 or 4 stops. Stage ourselves in Nia Bay, look for a weather window. We're going to head to Newport, Oregon, which is about a 25-hour run, 30-hour run. Spend a couple days in Newport, head to Fort Bragg, head to Bay Area under the Golden Gate, and then ultimately into Monterey. So the great thing about an old fishing, let's go back because this slide's really boring. The great thing about an old fishing vessel, they're just slippery. You know, this boat, we towed it, and the tugboat that towed it, the Red Bluff, good friend of mine towing the boat. We're going along, a beautiful sunny day. We're off Point No Point, and myself and the primary gentleman else behind the project, John Gregg, are on the boat, just the 2 of us. And I'm like, God, we are just flying along. How fast are we going? And I call up Greg on my cell phone, the skipper. I said, what are we doing? He goes, well, hold on here, crotchety old skipper. And he goes, oh, we're doing 11.5 over the ground. We're doing 12.5 through the water. I'm like, wow. And I said, he goes, I got 1,600 horsepower, and I'm using 20%. I'm like, so you're moving a tugboat in the Western Flyer at 11.5 knots using 200 horsepower. And so it just slips through the water. So the good thing about a boat like this is getting down the coast, you know, it's 24 hours to Newport, Oregon from Nia Bay. That's a fast little run, you know, doing dang near 12 knots. So got to be another question. Right here in the green.
Did you do anything to index like the historic timbers? You said there were like about 19 of them. Is anybody that didn't work on the boat able to see where those are?
Oh God, yeah. The keel is original. The keel is original of the boat. The keel sends are original of the boat. Horn timbers original. So when you're standing in the fish hole, you're standing on original timbers. They did do a new outer keel. The boat ran aground in 71 in Ketchikan, and it busted the keel, the first 7, 9, 10, 12 feet off the keel, so they replaced the outer keel. And some of the structural timbers on the port side are original. So you can see them and they are there. When we looked at the hull of the boat, and this was very early on, we looked at it with a 50-year optics. If the piece of wood in the hull of the boat, below the house, would last 50 years or more, we left it in the boat, you know, to keep some of that structure in the boat. With the house, we looked at it very differently. We looked at the house with a 20-year optics. So if it would last 20 years or more, we left it in the house. That's the DNA of the house. It's where Steinbeck drank and ate. So when you're in the actual house, it is almost dead original. It's the original boards, original beds, original seating, original table. The galley's a bit new. So, and the reason, so what we ended up with was a hull that's about 95% new, 5% old, and a house that's about 90% old and 10% new as a split. People have asked me, and I've had conversations about this, you know, when is an old boat not the original boat anymore? And this has been debated a lot in a lot of different conversations. The Adventurous, we all know the sailing vessel Adventurous, right? The beautiful 102-foot BB Crown and Shield. There are no original timbers in that boat, not a single original board in that boat. Blaze Holly took out the last original deck beam that was sacrificially hung on the wall on their last haul out. But we still call it the Adventurous. And in the boat shipwriting, you know, boat builder world, it's the shadow of the boat. If the boat is rebuilt in the shadow of the vessel, it is the original vessel. I jokingly say, if you really want to see the original Western Flyer, you just got to come to Marrowstone Island, because the whole damn boat's in my yard. As they dismantled the boat, I had them chainsaw it off 8-foot sections, and I put it on a flatbed, and it's in my wife and I's yard on Marrowstone in several giant shipping containers. But if I rebuilt that boat on Marrowstone, it really wouldn't be the Western Flyer. Somehow it's the shadow, it's the footprint of the Western Flyer. I think we might all be familiar with Tally Ho, Leo's project. I think there's no original timbers in that boat. He kind of half-heartedly did the transom in the veneer of the original wood. So it's an interesting thing. I think most of the boats you go on, there are very few original timbers. So when we found the boat looking like this upper right-hand corner, nothing had ever been done to the boat, and nothing had ever been done to the boat. So it's that blessing and a curse. We got to do the entire restoration in one 6-year push. But what we also got was a boat that had the original table and the original bunks and the original stove and the original layout. Nothing had ever been done to this boat. It was almost frozen in time. It's been an interesting thing. So another question, or I could just ramble. No, it's been debated. You know, there's a guy named Bob and Nia. So the crew that went on the Sea of Cortez trip, one of the crew members' name was Sparky Anea. And his grandnephew or something tracked it down through radio call numbers. It had changed its name in the 60s to the Gemini. But I've talked to multiple crew members and the past, everybody knew it was the Western Flyer. So it was so I don't know if it was rediscovered, kind of reintroduced into the world as the Western Flyer. So yeah, it fished as the Gemini from like 1968 to 2012 or something. Yeah.
So all original timber in the hull other than the ribs was fir?
Yeah, so the boat, I would say 95% Douglas fir. Planking, stern, stem, backbone, deck beams, decking, anything structural. There was teak doors, and there still are teak doors. It had iron bark caps and guards, and it had white oak framing. Other than that, it was a giant piece of Douglas fir. And, you know, 1937, this was the land of Douglas fir, obviously. So they just put a bunch of shipwrights on a train from New England, and they said, go build boats. So it was the preferred wood, and it was a great wood. Now fast forward 80 years, and the Douglas fir tree that the shipwrights are confronted with today, though the same species of tree, it is not the same tree in any shape or form. Most of the trees that these fishing vessels and all the other vessels that we know around here built out of Douglas fir were built out of a lowland Douglas fir, trees that were growing below 2,000 feet elevation. And it's a very different tree. It has a longer growth cycle, has a deeper winter-summer wood ring. so you get a little bit more resin locked in the structure. The wood that we buy now, the Douglas fir, you go to Edensaw Woods, pick up some Douglas fir to replank your boat. It's a 500-year-old tree with 40 rings per inch that's grown up in the higher elevations of Vancouver Island. And just my own personal experience, and probably every shipwright you'll talk to in the Northwest, that wood has no blood. It has no life left in it. It's kind of a balsa wood. If you take an old piece of lowland coastal Douglas fir, and there are a few around, every once in a while you find a piece, someone will come up. It's an amazing tree. The trees that are around us, there are 1 billion Douglas fir trees around us. In the life cycle of harvesting a Douglas fir tree, we are a little too early in the harvesting cycle. I think the perfect tree for wooden boats is about 140 to 160, 170-year-old Douglas fir tree growing lowland elevation. So I say that Bainbridge Island will be the new wood boat capital of the world. You get those beautiful trees, get another 30 years on them, they'll be great for harvesting, for hull planking. But most of the lowland fir trees are in a 40-year cycle for harvest, and you just can't get the wood. And that higher elevation Douglas fir, you don't meet many shipwrights that want to put that in a boat. It rots out really fast. I've seen way too many 10-year planks. And the cost of a piece of wood, you put a $4,000 piece of wood in a person's boat, and you got 3 days labor to hang it in the boat, you got a couple of bucks in that, you kind of want it to last more than 10 years. So most shipwrights have to kind of yellow cedar, kind of making a comeback pretty big in the Northwest. We've got a great source in Central Oregon, and a lot of the African hardwoods, Kaya, Sipo, Sapile, they just have more punch. Another question I can ramble on?
So with the sort of like research in the historical side, did you take a deep dive into looking at the documentation, or was everything like hands-on shapes?
It was hands-on. So it's a great question. So, very early on, we hauled it out, and the grandson of one of the builder showed up, and he had a great story of the family building this boat organically. Grandpa started with a pocket knife and a chunk of wood, and he carved himself a boat, and he built the Western Flyer. And I'm like, I don't think so, not in 1937. So we kind of dove into it because we were all headed, this is a cool project. And it immediately looks like a Hansen. If you're familiar with H.C. Hansen, it looks like a Hansen boat. So there was a lot of different folks kind of dispersing out into the ether. The Tacoma Maritime Library has a nice collection of Western boat building stuff. Somebody found a set of blueprints that said Western boat building H.C. Hansen, tied those two people together. Hansen's blueprints are all in Bellingham at the Watcom Maritime Museum. Somebody took a dive into the basement there, and they came out the other side with a sister ship that is the Western Flyer, but it doesn't say. So we have never been able to say, here's a set of blueprints. The boatyard burned, like all good boatyards burn sooner or later. This one burned multiple times. The last time it burned was in '52, and all of the records for basically the boatyard burned. The classic oily rag in the corner, so make sure whoever checks that shop down there. Is there any other questions? Back there.
Yeah, just curious, you're talking about stock. Did you guys ever have any problem with lead time or sourcing material?
Sourcing material. If you'd asked me any time during the project, the single hardest thing about a project of this scale, Blanchard knockabout, you want to hang a couple 3/4 inch planks, pretty easy to find that kind of wood. Resource acquisition was by far the hardest part, to try to find good quality material, not necessarily cost. It's always an issue, but it wasn't the issue. Just to find material. And we're blessed with Edensaw Woods. We're blessed with so many little pocket sawmills around here. But finding the oak was unbelievable. I called Kiwi at Edensaw Woods and said, give me some oak. I need some oak. He goes, what do you need? I need 3 inches by 4 inches dressed. That means finished size. So 3 by 4 dressed. It needs to be 18 feet long. He says, okay, I'll get on that. We usually pay about, $6.25 a board foot for bending oak. Pretty readily available in that 12, 14-foot length. He came back a couple days later and said it's unobtainable. I said, are you kidding me? It's just a board, right? It's this big around. How hard is it? The entire Ohio Valley is one giant oak tree as far as I can see. So we went around for 4, 5, 6 months, different sawmills, distributors. They wanted us, it was that extra length. They were cutting the trees in the forest at 16 feet 6 inches so they could get maximum yield out of a log. That butt log coming out of the ground, first 16 feet, 6 inches, that's going to get your premium lumber. It's either going to be distillery barrels or peeler plywood, the highest quality of the tree. So they wanted maximum yield. I wanted 18 inches more, and they said, great, you can buy the whole log at your risk. So we bought a log, they filleted it open and threw it out there, and sure enough, it had heart rot right up the middle of the tree. And we're like, oh Christ, this is going to get expensive. They came back and said, well, how about 36 bucks a board foot? We'll just do it. I'm like, $36 a board foot? We're going to need like $200,000 worth of oak for this project. So I got on the phone and said, I'm just going to start calling people. So I called her, and you got it, no, call this sawmill, call this sawmill, call that sawmill. And after maybe 30 sawmills, I made a visit to New England Naval Timbers, Duke, out he couldn't supply it, but I found, I was led to the forester at Berea College in Berea, Kentucky. And he said, well, we have about 20,000 acres that was gifted to the college in the 1800s that we harvest sustainably. We only, we manage for sustainable harvest only. Why don't you come out and see what you have? I told him the project. We cruised the forest. He said, yeah, we could get you 16 trees. So off of miles, 20,000 acres, he and I found 16, he found them, I had my hands in my pocket. He found 16 trees that were suitable. I went back on a subsequent trip. We went into the forest. Sure, they harvested the tree, falls down. First 19 feet were mine. And then as you saw in that video of the horses, on that property, everything has to be sustainably harvested off of there and has to be horse logged off. So first 19 feet, they hooked up the horses, 4 Suffolk punches, pulled it out of the forest, about 2 miles out of the forest, pulled this giant log, it was a big log. And we got it to the deck. They went back in and they grabbed the next 8 feet, the next 8 feet, the next 4 feet. Then they grabbed sizable branches and crooks. And at the end, you looked back and you couldn't see where the log came from. We went back a couple days later, and he's like, it was like the duff of the forest fluffed up in the air, fell back down, and it like a zipper closed where this, 10,000-pound log got pulled through the forest 2 days earlier. So that was it was one of the best highlights of the project for me, was just seeing this process. The horses, I love horses. We have horses. So resource acquisition was hard, really hard. So we took the first 19, and then the next they'd grade it for peeler logs. Some went to distillery barrels. The last of it, they were down to pallet wood. So part of that college is a forestry program, obviously, and a land stewardship program. So there were students on site that were evaluating the tree, what could be used, trying to have a learning experience while harvesting. And they don't just take oak. They go back for, chinky oak. They go back for tulip poplar. They get in there and they get black walnuts, poplars, other poplars. So it's incredible college. I highly recommend it. And the tuition's 100% free and has been since 1855. Yeah, they have a huge endowment that has kept them. And they've never charged $1. You actually can't get a job as a student there in your senior year. They pay you to live and go to school. So I think the guy back in that car hurts.
All the planking is SIPO.
SIPO, yeah, which
Remember that Tally-Ho used SIPO, but he put something harder?
he used Angelique and Wana, didn't he?
Oh,
He used Wana and Angelique, which also comes from French Guiana. Comes from a guy named Brad Ives. Angelique's a horrible wood.
How would you describe SIPO in terms of art and display?
SIPO is hard. So maybe not everybody, sapile is a really common lumber nowadays. It's like the wood of the 21st century. You see it everywhere. Ribbony, mahogany colored, very red. The SIPO that we were able to get through Edensaw, we did buy a Forest Steward Council FSC certified wood. I think we bought 6 logs in Africa and had them shipped to Europe for sawing. Were air dried, which really made a difference. You could actually, you look like you know something about wood. So you could actually block plane it. You could put like a number 3 hand plane on it and actually get a curl out of it. It was very different than using kiln dried, chattery sapile. The hardness is almost identical, but the other good side doesn't have the smell of sapile. Sapele kind of has a weird perfumey, gets in your nose. I thought it was great. But then I thought it was great because I didn't hang a single plank on the boat. And those planks are really heavy, and they're 40 feet long. It's a great wood. It's really stable. I have a ton of it left over. Obviously, I took all the plank scraps, and I've made a lot of parts for the boat, a lot of stuff for myself. It's really stable. So I actually liked it a lot. I wish I could get it a little bit more often. But the air dried makes a big difference. I think the kiln drying of any kind of wood makes it brittle. But they were able to steam it. This slideshow's gone to hell, so let's just go back a ways.
Nearly all the planks were steamed.
No, you can only like the garbards and broads. Look at this, it's like in backwards. It's better in reverse. Those are obviously all steamed. So the garboard, the first two broads, and then these planks going up through the tuck. I mean, you can see how many porta powers and bottle jacks are on that. You're pushing 2 inches of material around. Yeah, not all of them were steamed. All that planking, this is more fun the second time around. All this planking around the belly, those are all cold bent. I mean, they were able to pick up one edge and then do a width parallel. They actually made a planking map for the entire boat. So they were able to pick up one edge, do a dividers, saw it out. The greatest invention I think Pete Rust came up with it was he took a nice drop foot Milwaukee saw and put a crank bevel gauge on it to where it could crank. I think they could get 15 degrees one way and 2 degrees the other. So one guy could walk a 39-foot plank and just crank the knob and roll his own bevel. So you look like you know what I'm talking about. So it was a great invention. Like I say, of all the hundreds, if not thousands, of wood boats I've stepped on in my life, this is the only boat that does not leak one drop of water. Maybe the Martha. Martha doesn't leak a drop. This boat does not leak one drop of water. It leaked maybe 5, 6, 7 gallons when we first launched it, towed it, and if you were on the boat today, it's all evaporated. You're like, you don't even, you're on a boat. It's like bone dry in the bilge, like dusty bone dry. So it is possible. All these wood boat haters out there.
Are you going to do this talk again somewhere? Because I can think of
Never again. Not like this. Because I had a really cool slide. Maybe we could go back and see it. I don't know. I've given this talk a lot to a lot of people. It's fun to talk about the boat. We'll go back and see if we can see these are awesome planks. Port Townsend knows all about this boat. There's Pete Stein. Everybody knows Pete Stein, right? Maybe not. Horses.
Do you have original lumber that was repurposed maybe as decorative items?
Yeah, so, again, as they took the boat apart, I saved everything we could, which was a lot. I've been working, it's a gentleman in Santa Cruz, Ventana Surfboards, that makes hollow, rideable wood surfboards, and he uses a lot of the hull planking. And I have wrecked a lot of planks in my life, and it goes in the dumpster, and it goes away, and you're like, God, never want to see it again. This is the most beautiful wood in the world. So I recommend the next time you pull a plank off a boat, save it, pull the nails, pull the fasteners, throw it through an old planer. The reds in the oak or the fir, and it's unbelievable wood. So he makes hollow surfboards out of it, really beautiful, and sells them quite regularly. There's a gentleman in England who makes drum kits, and he made a drum kit out of a bunch of interior. We got to look at something. I can't just look at the. There we go. Look at that. He makes drum kits, and he actually made a drum kit that the drummer from Sky Cries Mary plays on stage, which is pretty cool. So the Western Flyer's doing some musical stuff. There's been ukuleles. There's been a guitar or two made. There's been a snowboard made. And then I do, as a thank you for donors, I take an old piece of the decking and up and put an original nail on there, and then people donate, and we write Western Flyer on it. So yeah, there's little keepsakes. I get requests I made some bookcases for people. It's beautiful wood. I was really shocked how the Douglas fir particularly, it's where the fasteners go through, that iron oxide kind of runs down the capillaries of the wood, and it just stains it. But then the red from the old bottom, it's really beautiful wood. But anyway, you've got another question?
Where'd you get all your bronze screws?
Bronze screws, they all came through Stay Fast. Yeah, they were reasonable. I mean,
So they were like 3 or 4 inches?
they're 4-inch number 20s. So, I mean, they're a decent screw. They're probably $2 a piece or something. It's probably 40,000 screws in the boat. This is rare. In all my years, we used to jokingly say we were, walking dinosaurs 30 years ago. No one will ever work on a wood boat like this again. I'd put a plank in a seiner or one of these halibut schooners, the Grant or the Northern or something. You'd put a plank on it. And in Port Townsend particularly, it is more vibrant than ever. There are more amazing projects going on than ever. The Blue Peter, the Malibu, the Thea, obviously the Adventurous. It's more alive than ever, which is pretty great to see. You get your hand up. You just.
Oh, no,
Any other questions? All right, I can ramble.